Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Phyllis Bennis, who directs the new Internationalism Project at IPS, focusing on Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped found and remains active with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. She works with many anti-war organizations, writing and speaking widely across the U.S. and around the world as part of the global peace movement. She has served as the informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Occupied Palestinian Territory. Phyllis also sits on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She has written and edited over 11 books. Thanks for joining us, Phyllis.
Great to be with you, Vince.
I wanted to start by referencing an article that you recently wrote with Curry Peterson Smith in the New York Daily News, Why Palestinians Are Mourning the Death of George Floyd. I'm going to read the first couple paragraphs of that article, and then if you can just go from there. Quoting, "Sparks from Black Lives Matter protests have jumped U.S. borders and caught fire elsewhere in the world, from Paris to Zurich to Sydney, and Palestine, where Floyd's murder has struck a special chord. Consider one pointed parallel. Iad Halak was killed only 5 days after George Floyd, and his story is all too familiar." Can you talk to folks about who Iad Halak is and how this story is so connected to what happened to George Floyd?
Iad Halak was a young Palestinian man in occupied East Jerusalem. He was severely autistic and attended a special school. He walked to that school every day. He knew the route to that school. And on this particular day, just 5 days after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, he was yelled at first by Israeli Border Patrol, which is a kind of hybrid between being a military, part of the Israeli military and part of the national police. It's a bit like the National Guard in this country, sort of that hybrid between police and military forces. They yelled at him to stop. He didn't understand what they were saying. And he was frightened, and he started to run. And the police later said they thought he had a gun. He had nothing remotely resembling a gun. He had a cell phone in his hand, as he did every day, because his parents had always taught him, carry your cell phone with you so you can always tell us when you get to school, so they would not have to worry about him. He ran into the school, into a trash room, was hiding behind a trash dumpster as they were firing at him. And they came in and fired and killed him 5 days after George Floyd. So although the exact circumstances obviously are very different, and the nature of repression is very different between that facing African Americans in the United States and that facing Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in occupied East Jerusalem or the occupied West Bank or occupied Gaza Strip, or those living as second-class citizens inside Israel, there are parallels. There are parallels as well. There are parallels in the origins of the kind of racism that underlies policing and the use of military force in both the United States and Israel, rooted in the other, the notion of the other. In Israel, the other are Palestinians, who, of course, are the indigenous people of that land, but who are unwanted by Israelis who want the land without the people. In the United States, the others initially were Native Americans in this country, African Americans who were brought, of course, as slaves. And it's in that context that we see this parallel of how racism from the beginning has undergirded how policing and police violence, state violence, happens in both countries.
What has the response been in Israel to this murder?
There was a bit more attention paid to it than is generally the case when Palestinians are killed. Palestinians are killed routinely in the occupied West Bank, less so in Jerusalem, because occupied East Jerusalem is physically, geographically part of the same city as West Jerusalem, which is the Israeli Jewish side of the city. The Israeli claim is that Jerusalem is a unified city, and it's the undivided capital of its country. In fact, of course, East and West Jerusalem are two very, very different cities. And while the official, quote, green line that separated the armistice line of 1949, that was then erased when Israel occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip in 1967, it's well known where that green line is, which side is the Palestinian side, which side is the Israeli side. So it's in that context that it's a little bit less frequent that Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem are killed, but it happens regularly enough and rarely gets much attention. In this case, it did get a lot of attention, partly because Palestinians themselves, who had already begun to join what were by then global protests against the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a police officer kneeling on his neck for 8.5 minutes. And that story, although again, we know how many times that's happened before, but for whatever reason, this one, partly because the video was so graphic and so horrific and so widely seen of this man dying in front of us, as this white cop stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the people shouting at him, "Stop, stop, you're killing him." So the protests had already begun. And I think for that reason, it resonated that here was something that looked very, very similar. And people began to make the links. The article that Corey and I published in the New York Daily News was published just a couple of weeks ago, but we actually started working on it more than a month ago, right at the time of the killing of Iad Halak. When we realized what these parallels were, there were issues about why it wasn't published right away. But I think that inside Israel, there was more attention paid this time. It does not mean that there will be any accountability, that no one has been arrested. The police who were involved have not been fired from their jobs. They've not been put on desk duty or any of the sort of cosmetic things that so often happen here. Some of that may happen. It's virtually unheard of for Israeli police or soldiers to actually be held accountable for their use of state violence against Palestinians.
I remember in 2014 and 2015, there was a Black Lives Matter chapter that had started in Gary, Indiana, which is located just about 20 miles to the west of us here in Michigan City, Indiana. And we took a convoy down in 2015 in August when Mike Brown was killed to join, some of our brothers and sisters down in Ferguson who had organizations and were protesting and in the streets. And I remember at the time being quite surprised, though I probably shouldn't have been, at the level of consciousness that existed even in a place like Ferguson, Missouri. And for the people who are listening or watching who've never been there, very similar to places, sort of smaller outliers from urban areas throughout the Rust Belt. You could find them in Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland. And when we showed up, there were people who were flying Palestinian flags right on Florissant Avenue. And now, part of the, I shouldn't have been surprised because, of course, it seems clear to me that throughout history, different struggles for Black liberation in the United States have always seen themselves in solidarity, or not always, but many times have seen themselves in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So this is something that stretches before 2020, before 2015, that this actually has quite a history here in the U.S.
Yes, the history is a long one of Black Palestine solidarity. And as you say, there have been Black liberation organizations in the U.S. SNCC was one. There have been others, the Black Panther Party, who expressed solidarity with the Palestinian struggle back in the late 60s and into the 1970s. But that was, of course, at a different period of history. It was a period when the Palestinian movement was rising in the context of national liberation movements all around the world. So there were similar movements across Africa, throughout parts of Latin America, parts of Asia. So it was much more part of a global movement against what was seen widely as U.S. domination, many called U.S. imperialism at the time. And it's in that context that it became more common. It was less common later. But I think we also have to recognize the role of movements, Palestinian movements in the United States that have worked for many, many years, often laboring in the darkness where very few people were paying attention. But something very particular happened in Ferguson, which I think is also an important part of the story. because it's not only that longstanding history and the fact that there are and were Palestinians who live in Ferguson, Palestinian Americans who have been organizing there for many years. But one of the things that was particular about Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed, when we saw this horrifically militarized response by the Ferguson police, this was one of the first times, this is a bit of a diversion, but just to mention, this was one of the first times that what we now know as the Pentagon 1033 program, a longstanding program from the 1990s, that allows local police agencies, local law enforcement, to obtain for free leftover military equipment, which can be anything from uniforms and computers and sort of office equipment to rifles and armored personnel carriers. So one of the questions that emerged quickly in Ferguson was, why is there an armored personnel carrier in the streets of this small town of semi-rural United States? And the answer was because the Ferguson Police Department, a very small, overwhelmingly white police department in a largely black community, had been notified by the Pentagon that this stuff was available and you can have it for free. How cool is that?
Right.
And once they had it, they figured out something to do with it. And that's why there was an armored personnel carrier on the streets. At the same time, protesters in Ferguson were being met with massive amounts of tear gas, very similar to what we've been seeing in the last weeks in the protests around the killing of George Floyd. And of course, that tear gas is made largely in the United States, a lot of it in Pennsylvania by federal laboratories, which was the same company that provided tear gas to the Israelis, to the Israeli military, to the Israeli police. When I was in and out of occupied Palestinian territories during the first uprising, the first intifada, in the periods around 1988, 89, 90, the tear gas that was used the same way there, when we would pick up the canisters after, they were always stamped federal laboratories. It was the same thing. And what happened was, because it was being broadcast around the world, because of social media and mainstream media, was broadcasting the protest in Ferguson, Palestinian activists saw it. And they used social media, Facebook and Twitter and whatever, to teach the local activists in Ferguson how best, based on their own experience, to respond to the tear gas, using onions and milk in certain ways to stop the tearing in people's eyes, to stop the damage. And they began to be the mentors of protesters in Ferguson on how to deal with this, with the same tools of repression that were being used against both. And that's one of the things that also was very particular in Ferguson that led to what you saw when you were there, of people carrying Palestinian flags and having this direct sense of solidarity. It was also very immediate and very personal for those folks.
I had never heard that before. So that's really cool to find this out.
An extraordinary moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk a little bit, and then we can move on. Can you talk a little bit about this connection between the U.S. military, U.S. police forces, and then also Israeli Defense Forces, police forces? It extends far beyond equipment. It goes to training, tactics, strategies, and so forth.
Well, the most important link is even beyond the training, tactics, strategy, et cetera. It goes to the $3.8 billion every year that we send in U.S. tax dollars, yours and mine, directly to the U.S. military, to the Israeli military. It used to be that the U.S. provided some economic aid to Israel. That became kind of an embarrassment because whatever else we think about it, Israel is, depending on whether you believe the CIA or the IMF, the numbers vary, but Israel is somewhere between the 23rd and 27th wealthiest country in the world. So people started wondering, why are we sending them economic aid at all? Right? So that was the first question. But the military aid has never been challenged. And in fact, under President Obama, they negotiated a new agreement, a 10-year agreement for $38 billion as the baseline. And then every year more would be added to that for specific things. So as it stands now, the U.S. pays $3.8 billion. It's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money. It's more money than was allocated for all of the childcare needs of this entire country in the pandemic support bill. So that gives you a sense of just how much money we're talking about. So that's the starting point of the U.S. aid to the Israeli military. And it goes directly to the military, no questions asked. All of the human rights protections that are written into U.S. laws that say, for example, the so-called Leahy Law, that says that the United States may not give military aid to any military unit that is known to have engaged in a pattern and practice of serious human rights violations. Well, that goes to pretty much the entire Israeli military. But it's never, that standard is never applied to Israel. It's exempt politically. That's changing because Congress is changing and because our movements have had success, but that's still where it stands. At the more immediate level, what you were referencing earlier, Vince, is the collaboration in training and tactics and that sort of thing, which has been also going on for quite a long time. An organization called the Anti-Defamation League, which positions itself as a civil rights organization and in fact does some work around documentation of civil rights violations, et cetera, anti-racist attacks, anti-Semitic attacks. But primarily, their main work is in supporting Israel. And in that context, they have, over the years, organized and funded delegations of police officers, sheriffs, law enforcement officials from small towns and big cities all across this country to go to Israel for periods of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to train jointly with the Israeli military and the Israeli National Police. What they're supposed to be learning from the National Police, for instance, are methods at dealing with mass protests. Well, the Israeli National Police deal with mass protests primarily dealing with a militarily occupied population. So that's what they are teaching our local police officers. Certainly is not to say that it took collaboration with Israel for U.S. police to be grounded in racism. We know that the origins of police forces at all in this country is grounded in the slave patrols of the early 1800s. That led to the notion of having a police force, was that you needed organized groups of, it was always men, organized groups of armed men who were authorized to go after escaped people who had been enslaved. So it's in that context that these collaborations go forward. They learn from each other, they teach from each other, and what they teach is the worst examples of race-based policies on both sides.
People are listening to this right now. They're asking themselves, maybe people who have never been involved with these movements before, what are some of the organizations that you would recommend people follow, get involved with, or support who are specifically working on issues related to Palestinian rights, Israeli crimes?
Sure. Well, one of my own organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, is one of the very biggest, with about 20 or 22,000 members across the country, chapters in about 40 cities, student chapters on universities across the country, doing work, among other things, on what we call the Deadly Exchange Campaign, which is challenging this specific training collaboration between U.S. police and the Israeli military and police forces. So that's one that's doing great work. That's jvp.org. The work of Students for Justice in Palestine is one of the best that's working on college campuses. There's a host of local organizations where people are. And I think that the sense of integration of movements is one of the things that's been very exciting in the last few years, where, as you mentioned, what you were seeing in Ferguson, we're seeing in many different places where different organizations are taking up the commitment to challenge U.S. policy. U.S. policy is what determines whether the Palestinians will be able to succeed in their fight for liberation. It's not about how many states there are, one state, two states, red state, blue state. That's not really the issue, in my view, and I think the view of many. A two-state solution isn't really possible anymore. Whether it ever was is a different issue. It's not now. But the bottom line is, it's not our call. You know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. Why should I get a say in how many states there are in this territory 7,000 miles away? My job is to hold my government accountable for what it does in its policies, what it does with my tax dollars. And so saying that $3.8 billion of my tax money going to the Israeli military every year is not acceptable. Should be part of what everybody's work is. If we're working on the Green New Deal or Medicare for all, one of the constant questions is, that sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it, right?
Right.
The biggest way we're going to pay for it is cut the military budget. A piece of how we're going to cut it, how we're going to pay for it, is to cut the U.S. military aid to Israel. They fit right together.
Let me ask you just straight up, what do you think a reasonable amount to cut the military budget would be? I'm not going to scoff at any number that you throw out there, because I've heard 10%, 30%, 90%. What do you actually think is reasonable in the short term?
Right. There's a bill in Congress right now, an amendment to the current what they call the NDAA, the National Defense Appropriations Act, for the military budget for next year. For the first time, there's actually an amendment, which is going to be voted on today, the day that we're recording this, to say that there should be a 10% cut. I don't think it's going to win, frankly. I hope it does. I hope that there are 250 members of Congress who are brave enough to say in public what many already recognize, that the military budget is bloated, that it does not keep us safe. But we'll see. But it's important historically, because this is the first time we've had this pattern of every year, the military budget goes up.
Right.
Higher and higher and higher. This is the first time there's actually been an official effort in the Congress, in both the House and the Senate. Senator Bernie Sanders in the House, in the Senate, and House leaders Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan in the House, that are saying, no, we've got to cut it. It's a first step.
Yep.
Now, my position and the position of my organization, the Institute for Policy Studies, and our National Priorities Project, the position of the Poor People's Campaign, for instance, and that of Reverend William Barber, is that the cut should be $350 billion, more or less half the military budget. It's perfectly reasonable. And my colleague, Lindsay Kashgarian of the National Priorities Project at our institute, wrote this brilliant piece a few months ago that we finally got into the New York Times, with a great set of specifics about how you would cut $350 billion and still keep us safe. Because the bottom line is, being the bully of the world is not what keeps us safe. What keeps us safe is having a population that's healthy, that has jobs, that has education, where children are safe. That's what means the safety that we talk about and like to put on our military. Our military isn't what does it. The military makes us more at risk. So we have to change all of that. We have to change the definition of what keeps us safer. Throwing money at more aircraft carriers. You know, we have 11 aircraft carriers, right? And I don't know if when you were in the military, you were ever on one of them.
No.
But when I was working as a journalist, I went on one of these junkets once onto one of these giant aircraft carriers. It's like a city. It holds between 5,000 and 7,000 sailors. It has about 20 floors, and it has a fleet of about 20 or 25 planes, bombers, that live on the ship. And it's surrounded by a flotilla of smaller ships, anywhere from 30 to maybe 50 or 60 of them. So the whole thing together is like 10,000 people. It's like a small town, right? And we have 11 of these. No other country in the world has more than one that functions. There's a couple that had two. But there's only, I think it's 6 other countries that have any. Most countries in the world don't think they need aircraft carriers. Most countries don't think they need nuclear weapons either. We're the only country that's ever used our nuclear weapons. So we have these weapons of war. We spend more on the budget than the next 10 countries. And that includes big spenders like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia, all these countries that spend billions and billions and billions of dollars. We spend more than the next 10. So that tells you that it's kind of nuts.
Yep.
It's just kind of nuts, and we should cut it.
And the reason I also think it's important, just even if it is the 10%, there's other countries around the world that are increasingly militarizing. I mean, so if you look at, I was reading about India and the amount of weapons that they're now importing. I was reading about nations all over the world that are increasing, have been further and further militarizing, especially in the post 9/11 world. And I would assume that a lot of this also is tied to the fact that they see the United States, they see the belligerence of U.S. empire, and they have to think to themselves, okay, I mean, there's also reasons states do this, of course, for their own people, to kind of keep movements in check for whatever national interests they have. But a portion, of course, of what's driving this is people looking at the United States and saying, well, if this is the way that we're going to go, then we have to also militarize. I mean, is that how you view it as well, or?
Well, I think it varies. I think for some states that's certainly true. For other states, India is one that you just gave as an example. The Modi government in India has locked itself into an ideological position matching Trump's. It's a racist, discriminatory government that is based on Hindu nationalism. It's profoundly Islamophobic. It's profoundly glued to its relationship to Israel. Among other things, it includes buying a lot of arms from Israel because it sees Israel as a parallel force in opposing Islam. Of course, the 300 to 400 million Indian Muslims are the ones who are paying an enormous price for that militarization. But at the same time, the alliance between Modi and Trump is growing. So for Modi, the fact that the U.S. is spending these enormous hundreds of billions of dollars every year on weapons is not something that he feels like he has to respond to with fear, but more as a model for what an important country does. That's what we do. So I think this is a very serious, it has a very serious international effect.
Now, while we give $3.8 billion and more to the Israeli government, we're also imposing sanctions, devastating sanctions under normal, quote unquote, normal circumstances, particularly devastating in the context of a global pandemic, the worst that we've seen in over 100 years. Can you talk about what those sanctions have done to people around the world? I'm thinking here, of course, of Iran and Venezuela, but other places as well, and the devastating impact they're having on the people, not necessarily the governments of these countries, which is part of the same discussion, but the people of those nations.
Economic sanctions devastate populations. They rarely have significant impact on governments, whether those governments have any shred of democracy or whether they're terrible repressive governments. Doesn't really matter. In almost every case, the government protects itself and the people are the ones who suffer. We saw this in Iraq from the time of the first Gulf War in 1991, the sanctions that were imposed even before that in 1990 and remained in place for 12 years until the U.S. invaded and overthrew the government in Iraq. Under those sanctions, at least 500,000 children under the age of 5 were killed by sanctions, by our sanctions, some of them imposed in the name of the United Nations, others imposed directly by the United States. And it was one of the most extraordinary, genocidal in its impacts of sanctions, the most devastating kinds of throttling of a country, what had once been a wealthy country, that suddenly was not allowed to sell its oil. A small amount of oil was allowed to be sold under these very restrictive conditions of what was known as the Oil for Food program, but it was not enough to support a population of tens of millions of people, and of course the most vulnerable, who were old people and most especially children. And famously in 1996, when Madeleine Albright, who was then the Secretary of State, was on national television on 60 Minutes, and Judy Woodruff asked her the key question, we've heard about the children, we've heard about the 500,000 children that have been killed by U.S. sanctions. How do you justify that? And without missing a beat, she said, it's a hard price, but it's a high price, but we think the price is worth it. I always wanted to ask her, you have 2 daughters, Madam Secretary. If they were among those children, would you still say the price is worth it? It was intentional that people were going to suffer, the theory being that then they will rise up against this government we don't like. Well, the reality is people are not stupid. They know the government is repressive. They know that better than we do. We were the ones supporting Saddam Hussein's government with the basis of building biological weapons even before that time. So they had no illusions. They knew who was responsible for their suffering. That yes, their government was very repressive, but it was not starving its population. That took the United States. That was our job. And people knew it. So the notion that this is how you change governments, this is how you do regime change. It doesn't work. There is not a single example of economic sanctions being imposed that led to the population, indigenous population of a country rising up to overthrow their own dictator. It just doesn't work that way. What does happen is that people die in huge numbers. And as you say, right now, the most extensive system of sanctions are being levied against both Venezuela, with the goal of doing what Henry Kissinger talked about when he imposed sanctions on Chile during the brief 3-year period of socialism under the elected government of Salvador Allende. And he said, we are going to make the economy scream. That is what is being done to the economy in Venezuela. It's being done to the economy of Iran. And in the context of a global pandemic, where healthcare systems, medical care was already shaky and very dicey, whether it would be available for most people, now is almost not available in Venezuela. In Iran, it is still available, but not sufficient. It's not easily accessible, and there are huge numbers of medicines that are not available at all. The U.S. position, when you ask the State Department, no, you can't put that on us. Food and medicine has always been exempt from the sanctions, which technically is true in the Iran case. But the problem is, it doesn't matter for corporations and especially for banks that, number one, have to jump through an enormous set of hoops to get the exemptions to issue loans for some kind of a shipment of drugs, for instance. And the corporations who might produce those drugs just are not willing to take the risk that the U.S. is going to haul them into court for violating the sanctions. So the impact of the sanctions, whether it's written into the law or not, is that it denies the people of Iran, the people of Venezuela, increasingly the people of Syria, the people of a host of countries around the world who face U.S. economic sanctions. They are the ones who pay the price.
What do you think is the mechanism to stop those kinds of destructive policies? I mean, how much of this is pressure against the executive, and how much of this are things that Congress could do?
Both. There needs to be massive pressure against executive branches, and there has to be massive both education and pressure on members of Congress who still fall into the trap of saying, well, we don't want to go to war, so we'll impose sanctions. Sanctions are the alternative to war. That's wrong. Sanctions are not an alternative to war. Sanctions are an act of war by other means. And we have to understand it in that way. Most members of Congress, I think, don't understand that, and they need that education. So we need to build the relationships with members of Congress, with their staffs, so they're prepared when the executive sends out a memo saying, we're about to impose sanctions on Chad because of X. And we don't want to go to war, but this is what we're going to do instead. They need to be prepared immediately to come back and say, no, that's going to impact the people of Chad and not the government. We need something else. What we need is diplomacy. Right now, diplomacy has been stripped of its legitimacy, stripped of its participants. People have been leaving the State Department in droves since the Obama administration left and the Trump administration came in, because they see that there is no room for diplomacy in the Trump era. The first thing that Trump did when he took office was to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, one of the greatest diplomatic triumphs of the last 20 or 30 years. And in that context, I think we've also defunded the State Department. The State Department right now makes less than half of the 10% of the military budget. 10% of the military budget that some in Congress are calling for cutting comes out to about $74 billion. The budget of the State Department is only about $30 billion. It's less than half of that. So that tells you something about what our priorities are. We need to be privileging diplomacy over war, not the other way around.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. In terms of pressure that we could put on Congress and the executive, I'm thinking of an article. It's a different article than the one I have printed out here to talk to you about, but there was an article that you wrote also with Reverend Barber about repurposing the equipment, the capabilities of the military, and I really liked that. Before I get into that, I remembered the point I wanted to make as you were speaking. I think you're making a very important point with members of Congress that, in fact, when I was young, I had assumed that everybody who was a member of Congress was an evil person who knew exactly what the U.S. military empire was doing and just did it because they were funded by the military-industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. Probably a lot of things 22, 23-year-old anti-war activists think. As time has gone on and I've worked with and or interacted with local members of Congress, people over the years, it's very true what you're saying, and you have you're right there in D.C. dealing with these people. But even in my limited experiences, it is very true, including who will replace Pete Visklosky here in the 1st Congressional District in Indiana, Frank Mervan, who's a really nice guy who is a town trustee, voted as a town trustee, has very little idea about U.S. foreign policy. And it isn't that he has really sort of evil, wicked views of the world. It's that he just simply doesn't know. He was a town trustee for 15 years before now he's going to U.S. Congress. My thinking has been to try and reach out to him, offer an olive branch on this issue, and try and build a relationship so we can have at least some little influence over the way he might be making these decisions. In any case, that's an aside, but it's very important because I think there's a lot of people out there who think the opposite, which just isn't true.
Well, it is important. It's not completely untrue either. There
Right.
are plenty of people whose campaigns are funded by military corporations who have no interest in the civilian consequences of these wars that the U.S. initiates all around the world and sanctions that it imposes all around the world. But there's plenty who simply don't know. And that's why we always need to be trying to engage with members of Congress and their staffs in their offices at home and in D.C. when we can do that. And at the same time, we have to be protesting when they do the wrong thing, thanking them when they do the right thing. That's an important one that we often forget. But protesting and demanding that they do the right thing, calling them out in the pages of the local newspaper, letters to the editor, calling radio talk shows and saying, Congressperson so-and-so really blew it this time, and we shouldn't allow that to happen again. The first thing that members of Congress's staffs do in the morning usually is do a Google search and find out if they were mentioned in the press anywhere. So you always want to use their name in these things so that they find it and they see what people are saying about them. That helps to change their positions.
Thank you for that, Phyllis. What about repurposing this equipment, the kind of movement that it would take, which will kind of segue us into a conversation about how to sort of rebuild an anti-war movement, or how you would even phrase that. But I'm thinking of an article that you wrote with Reverend William Barber about using that material. And it's one of the few times that I've actually seen people articulate, though you might be aware of others, what we would do with the amount of the capacity, the equipment, the resources that we have with the U.S. military. I've long thought, you have all of the helicopters, the satellites, so on. Like, how could this be repurposed to deal with climate change? These are the kind of things that I've been thinking about over the years. One of the few times that I've seen it articulated in an article like that. And it made a lot of sense to me. And it's, so anyway, I'm wondering where that came about, and what do you think it would take to build the kind of movement needed to repurpose the equipment from the U.S. empire?
It's a huge challenge. And overall, I'm not in favor of keeping the military intact and just sort of using it for good things instead. In the short term, that's what we need. In the short term, the military has access to resources and stockpiles of resources far beyond on a person-to-person basis than the rest of us do in this country. So at the moment, in the first weeks of the pandemic, when we didn't have enough masks, we still don't, when we didn't have enough gowns and gloves and PPE, all the stuff that was missing, the military was doing fine. The military has a network of hospitals across the country. It has a network of clinics on military bases across the country that are well-equipped, well-staffed, good doctors, surgeons, ICUs, ventilators, all the stuff that we desperately needed. A little bit of that was dealt with by sending 2 hospital ships, one on the East Coast, one on the West, to corona hotspots from their birth, on the theory that they would take non-corona cases to lighten the load of overwhelmed hospitals. It was a reasonably good idea. It was what those hospital ships should be doing. The key question is that of control. And what Reverend Barber and I had talked about when for people listening who don't know, Reverend William Barber is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, comes out of North Carolina, an extraordinary African-American minister who led the Moral Mondays movement that completely reversed the right-wing trajectory of politics in North Carolina in the last few years. And in the last 3 years, with the rise of the Poor People's Campaign and our work at IPS, we've been the sort of research arm of the campaign. And it's been a gift. It's been a privilege working with the extraordinary team with Reverend Barber, Reverend Liz Theo Harris, the other co-chair, and this incredible team of activists who have put together this movement that stands for the evil triplets that Dr. King taught us, the need to fight back against racism, militarism, and poverty, and we added climate to that. So those four things shape the work of the campaign. And I've worked particularly closely with Reverend Barber over these last years. And when we were talking about this in terms of what do we think about how the military functions, and we suddenly realized, the military has these resources that it decides. It was what sparked it was our response. We had both read a couple of articles, I think in Newsweek or something like that, that included reporting of a press conference by the chief of staff of, I think it was the Army and the National Guard, or a couple of different Army military sectors, saying we're going to give so much of our medical equipment to the civilian medical needs. And there was this sense of, we're going to give you this gift. And we both had the same reaction of, who the hell told them that they get to choose? Why did they get to say how much of their equipment, which we all pay for, we pay for the medical school for these doctors, we buy the ventilators. Why do they get to choose how much gets to stay in the military stockpiles and how little gets to go over to the public health officials? So that was what led to this article. And it goes back to the point is not to have the military take over running the pandemic response, which we were seeing. There were people saying that. There were letters being written, letters to the editor, that sort of thing, saying, the military is very disciplined around this. They know how to get stuff done. And yeah, that's true. They are disciplined and they can get stuff done. And usually at the end of it, people are dead.
Yep.
That's not who I want in charge of public health in this country. But they also have great trained medical personnel. They have these hospitals. They have these clinics. Why shouldn't the civilian officials that are in charge of public health in this country, whether it's the Surgeon General's office or someone else, why aren't they in charge of saying, what, we're in an emergency, and in emergencies, you military people don't get to decide how much of your supplies, how many of your personnel are going to be repurposed into the civilian world. We remain in charge, but we're now in charge of your stuff too.
You mentioned that this was this sort of short-term vision of how we can alleviate some of the damage and destruction caused by the pandemic, how we might repurpose some of this material. You also mentioned that wouldn't be the sort of long-term vision. What for you would be that long-term vision beyond, say, just repurposing some of this within this current context?
Yeah, a long-term vision, when I'm imagining what it would look like, is we wouldn't have a global military force. We wouldn't have nuclear weapons at all. No one would have nuclear weapons. We would abide by what we signed on to in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that says all these countries around the world agreed not to seek or build a nuclear weapon in return, not for 5 countries having them, but for those 5 countries agreeing in Article 6 to get rid of them, to negotiate the demilitarization and denuclearization of themselves. You ask people about that now in Washington, and they laugh in your face. We were never serious about that. Well, we were, and they should have been. So that's part of it. But it means having, some small, sort of police force of our borders and our coasts to make sure that, we're not invaded by some other country or by pirates or something, I suppose, but not having a military that goes abroad seeking countries to conquer, seeking resources to claim as our own, seeking moons and planets to grab as our own. That's not what a legitimate military is for. And I think we should get rid of it.
And in order to do so, because I agree with all of the above that you said, let's talk a little bit about How would you even frame this? I've heard people say we need to build a new anti-war movement. I've heard people say we need to rebuild the anti-war movement. I've heard people say we need to think of something different than the way that we've thought of the anti-war movement in the past. I'm sure you've heard all of those things as well. What are your thoughts on this? I think it's one of the most important questions going right now. Over the years, we've seen a ton of movements get a lot of attention and make some headway. I mean, you mentioned even movement for Palestinian rights. I'm thinking of the environmental movement, student movement, youth movement against guns in the U.S. and school shootings and access to weapons, the NRA. I mean, I'm thinking of so many movements I've seen over the years who I could ask friends who are not activists or organizers who right away go, oh, yeah, I know of the kids from Florida, or I know of this movement, or I've seen the Sunrise movement. How do you frame this question or this challenge, and what do you think we might do about it?
Well, if we
and what are
start
people
with,
already doing about it? I should mention as well. I'm sorry, because I know that there's people out there who have continued that work and, often, as you mentioned, in the dark.
if we start with those options about we need a new movement, we need a different movement, we need a better movement, we need a completely different kind of movement, my answer is yes. We need all of that. We need all of that. I would say that your assessment right now is grounded in the fact, in a chronological fact of how old you are. If you were talking in the period from 2001 to about 2007 about what movements are out there, what are visible, the anti-war movement would have been the top of the list.
Yep.
Far more than the anti-racist movement, far more than the environmental justice movement, far more than most of the movements that are on the rise now. Doesn't mean we were any better than they are. It doesn't mean that they are better than the anti-war movement now. It's a product of both the times, the nature of the wars. Moments create movements, movements create leaders, leaders create movements. It's all very cyclical in a sense. So in that period, right after 9/11, a new and broad anti-war movement emerged. The biggest of the coalitions at that time, which I helped to create in 2002, was called United for Peace and Justice, UFPJ, which at its height had about 1,500 member organizations that included trade unions, it included environmental groups, it included women's organizations, youth groups, it included students, it included everybody, as well as the people who had been working on anti-war stuff, solidarity movements for years and years. Everybody was there. Because at that moment, how we saw history was grounded in the primacy of military interventions as the key linchpin of what US capitalism, US imperialism was all about. So that was the movement that we needed, was to challenge that central point of the evil stuff that the US government was doing around the world. And it culminated in 2003 on February 15th as part of a global movement, the day the world said no to war. 14 million people around the world in somewhere between 665 and 800 cities around the world held protests on one day with the same slogan, the world says no to war, in 100 different languages. There's an amazing film that's going to, a little plug here, that's going to be launched in the United States on September 21st called We Are Many. That's the story of that protest.
I know Amir.
You know Amir, that's great. He's a close friend. And I say that understanding that I'm in the film a lot, so whatever. But it's a great film about movements and how movements rise. So in that moment, the anti-war movement was the centerpiece of progressive movements. Things started to change in 2007, 8, and 9. Some people have said that, well, it's because when Obama was elected, everybody in the peace movement kind of disappeared and said, oh, Obama's going to do the work now. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think people say that who were not around in the peace movement at that time and have no idea what was actually happening. That was probably true for some supporters of the peace movement who were kind of supporters of the Democratic Party or whatever and saw Obama as, the great hope of anti-war people. I think most of us, particularly the leadership of that movement and particularly the left side of the leadership of that movement, were all too aware that the first African-American president was never going to be transformative on foreign policy. In fact, I think the things that Obama was able to do in terms of the shifts on Cuba, the normalization of relations with Cuba, and the Iran nuclear deal in particular, those two things, were far more transformative than I thought he would be able to pull off. I didn't think he'd even be able to do that. And I was thrilled that he was. But what was also happening at the time was three crucial factors. Number one was the nature of the war changed dramatically. Under George Bush, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were characterized, the global war on terror was characterized primarily by large-scale invasions of ground troops. Hundreds of thousands of US soldiers rotated in and out of Iraq and Kuwait and Afghanistan in those years. It was on the front pages all the time. There were US casualties, not anywhere near what they were, say, in Vietnam, but serious numbers of US casualties. Suddenly, the war turned much more to focus on airstrikes and drones. The numbers of ground troops were being pulled back. Now, in Afghanistan, that was not the case. After a 9-month period of claiming to be vacillating about whether to do a so-called surge, Obama said, yes, we're going to do a surge. Within that first year, he sent 47,000 additional troops, 30,000 as part of the surge, 17,000 earlier when he first came into office. It was one of those moments of, we're going to take some months to figure out what to do. But in the meantime, we're going to send 17,000 more troops, right? So that was true in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan had never had the level of attention that Iraq had. And it still didn't, even with those additional troops. And the numbers never matched what they were at the beginning under Bush anyway. So you had, on the one hand, that. You had far less attention being paid to the wars. Number two, the most important reason, you had the economic collapse, which meant that for many, many people who had been focused, just obsessively on trying to build an anti-war movement, suddenly were faced with losing their job, potentially losing their homes. The crisis was enormous, not what we're seeing now as a result of the pandemic and its resulting economic crisis, but a huge economic crisis that wreaked havoc on all kinds of movements, including the movement that was until then the most central movement in the US. So, and then the third part was, and one aspect of that was that a lot of people who had been working in the anti-war movement were suddenly faced with necessity of working in other movements because of their own conditions, movements against the denial of housing, movements around jobs. All those things became much more urgent for a lot of people who had had the privilege, if you will, of working on an international issue. And then, the other side of it was the broad question of how do we make decisions within the movement? And there were arguments and there were fights within the movement, within United for Peace and Justice. There was a lot of debate about what to do. Should the focus be, we need to do what we've always done, but we need to do it better. We need younger people. We need more people of color. Or the other position, more or less, was we don't need to be doing what we've always done. We need to do something different. And the thing we need to do that's different is to really focus on getting the information that we have about the cost of war, the human cost, the cost to the environment, and crucially, the cash cost that's taking half of our federal budget and preventing us from paying for housing and healthcare and education and all the things that we desperately need into the hands of the leaders and the activists in all these other movements, to make the issue of the wars a component of all the other movements rather than focusing on building up an independent anti-war movement. Now, in fact, we probably needed to do both. In my view, we needed much more on the second. But that wasn't the decision that was largely made. Most people thought we needed to really focus on building the independent anti-war movement. I think that was the wrong decision, and I think we paid a price for that. But it was not the main reason. The main reason had to do with objective circumstances in which we were working.
Where do you think we go from here? In other words, Bernie's campaign seemed to be a way for people to sort of orientate themselves around any number of issues. One of the reasons we liked the campaign was because it was bringing so many people into the mix who don't self-identify as progressives or leftists. The campaign platform grew and I think became better from 2016 to 2020. Yet in both cases, it seems that one of the issues that were maybe lacking the most was U.S. foreign policy. So I agree with you. I think all of that makes a lot of sense, though I will say that I think that there are some people from the left side of the movement who I think have placed a lot of emphasis on that sort of Obama factor. In other words, when I was interviewing Medea Benjamin, I think she focused a little more on that issue than I would, or that you just explained. I think your explanation has been one of the more sort of nuanced and robust that I've heard, and I think it makes a lot of sense because it's at least how we experienced it, I think, in many ways on the ground as well, especially living in the Rust Belt and with the financial crisis. It was like, it's almost like the same right now. This is jumping all over the place, but I would like to get your thoughts on this. There's a lot of people locally who are interested, I think, in working on issues like the fact that the extra $600 a week for the unemployment insurance benefit is going to run up, that we have the moratorium on evictions is going to run up, that there's a whole series of really economic catastrophic things that are going to happen to people. And I've been wondering, how do we, even the people who are out there right now, a lot of the folks say trying to take down statues and so forth, it would seem to me that there's a symbolic importance to that, but that over the last several weeks, we haven't seen that necessarily bring the kind of people that we would want to also bring into the movement who aren't already existing. Like the people we know in Chicago who are around the Columbus statue on Sunday are like all of the leftists that we know in Chicago. It's like the 2,000 or 3,000 leftists that we know in Chicago who are doing that. We don't really, we agree, we're like, yeah, of course, take it down. But to focus that amount of energy or to continue to get into these skirmishes with police, it would seem to make more sense to me to focus on pushing something like Bernie's bill in Congress to cut 10%, to focus on extending the $600 unemployment insurance for people who are desperately in need of this. How are you viewing even the current moment? How do we act and organize in more strategic ways right now? I know those are big questions, but.
Sorry, and then I have to go, but
yeah.
I will try to do this one, because I think it is really important. I think that the issue is our great word, intersectionality. Everybody who's working to defend the $600 additional unemployment insurance grant, which is crucial for people's lives right now, should be talking about the need to cut the military budget, because that's where the money goes. Right now, 54 cents of every discretionary federal dollar goes to the military. That's unacceptable. That's why we don't have enough money to care for people. The richest country in the world, and we're at the bottom of the list of dealing with this pandemic. Rwanda is doing better. Vietnam has beat us now the second time, if you will, by a huge level. Much poorer countries who prioritize their use of resources differently than we do. So I do think it's crucial that people work on that $600 a week thing. People desperately need that for their lives. It's not going to get better this week just because somebody said that $600 expires. People's lives don't expire, except some will from this. So I think that what we need to look at is, how do we look at those trade-offs? I love working at IPS. One of our projects is the National Priorities Project, which some of your listeners may know of. It's a long-standing, it used to be an independent project, whose goal is both to expand people's understandings of how the federal budget works in general, which is really complicated, but on a very specific level, focusing on the military budgets. Where does that money go? What else could it be used for? So one of the great things they have, and I use it all the time when I used to travel a lot speaking, the last thing I would do before heading off to whatever city I was going to, I would look them up, and with 3 clicks on their website, I could get let's say I was going to Dayton, Ohio. I could click on Dayton, and I would have the exact amount of tax money that the population of Dayton had paid this year for a number of things, either for the whole military budget, for the Iraq war since 2003, for the Afghanistan war just this year, for whichever one I pick. And then I could pick any one of about a dozen trade-offs, or a combination of them, and say how many kids could get health care, how many children could get places in Head Start, how many students could get Pell Grants, how many houses could be retrofitted for green, environmentally better heating. There's like a dozen of them. You can take one or pick them all with whatever you want, and it'll tell you exactly what you could do with that money. Now, the way budgets work, it doesn't work this way. It does in the Senate. It doesn't in the House. That, like, if the bill in the House calling for a 10% cut passes, and it passed into law, that's not a guarantee of how that money would be used. The Senate does get the right to do that kind of playing around with the amounts. But money is fungible. If you save it in one place, you can have it available somewhere else. So even if it's not written in, public demand, public pressure can make that happen. So that's how we say, well, Green New Deal sounds great. Medicare for all sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it? There's always that kind of
right.
component. Well, the easy answer is cut the military budget. That's where you're going to get the money. That's where you're going to get the money for healthcare and for a Green New Deal and for green jobs and for infrastructure and for dealing with the pandemic. That's where the money is going now, and it's being wasted. It's being wasted on killing people around the world, and it's being wasted in not being available to saving the lives of people.
Thank you so much for your time, Phyllis. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed it, and like I said, we've been reading and using your work for many years, and I greatly respect you. So thank you.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Phyllis. Take care. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.